Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, directed by Gore Verbinski, starring Johnny Depp, Orlando Bloom, Keira Knightley, Joffrey Rush, amongst many other people. This review is very late. I was going to put it out a few weeks ago, around the time of its 20th anniversary, but timing and other stuff that I had going on just made me put it off to the side, but I was determined nonetheless to get this out to you guys. I've wanted to talk about this movie for ages, and watching it last night for the first time in quite a few years, it was a really fun experience. Reliving all the great classic moments that I think it's safe to say that this movie is a classic, very culturally significant, and if you've seen many of the memes and GIFs online, this movie's going to make its way into those circles. As you all know, the story of the Black Pearl is Captain Jack Sparrow wanting to get his hands back on the ship that he lost due to a mutiny and has to recruit certain people like Will Turner, who also has a connection to the crew of the Black Pearl. A very simple swashbuckling adventure, yet it's the kind of movie that when you rewatch it, it still has the same effect. This came out on July 9th of 2003, 10 days before my 13th birthday. And an interesting fact for you guys, this I thought for a long time was my introduction to Johnny Depp, but it wasn't until many years later when I was older that I realized he was Edward Scissorhands. But an old friend of mine who I used to work with who absolutely adores Johnny Depp for many reasons. She told me about his part as Edward Scissorhands and I said, hold it. Edward Scissorhands? You didn't know that? No. Completely taken aback by that knowledge, had no clue. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who's really into pirate adventures specifically, or in film, television, or literature, but this film I think had a very unique way of resonating with a lot of people in my generation, this guy included, mostly because of Johnny Depp's portrayal of Captain Jack Sparrow. We will talk about that for sure, and there is absolutely no way I'm not going to quote him. I know I have a bad habit of quoting movies in real life and on here, but Captain Jack Sparrow is just too good of an opportunity to pass up any kind of reference at all. If I didn't quote him at least once, I would be disappointed with myself. But to backtrack, this movie, I think, as some others have said, is very much similar to Star Wars, the original Star Wars, where it had that very big cultural impact that over time has managed to cement itself in film history. Whereas initially, it didn't really receive the greatest reception. A lot of people were convinced somehow that this was not going to be a good time, since it was based off of a theme park ride. The audience reception, I think, told a different story, because I can remember when I saw the second one a few years later, everybody got excited when the film started. It goes to show you just how much of an impact this film had on people. To be honest, I'm not really sure where to start with this one. I guess we could start with the main attraction, Johnny Depp as Captain Jack Sparrow. Similar to Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker in The Dark Knight, he's the one that everybody, if not most people, remember this movie for. Everybody else in here does get their moment, but Johnny Depp is really the one that elevates this movie a lot higher than it would have been otherwise. Probably would have been a good movie without him, but he elevates this to a whole nother level. At one point, Hugh Jackman was considered to play Jack Sparrow, but because of how not well known he was outside of Australia, they decided to look at other actors, and Johnny Depp was already famous for films like Edward Scissorhands, Benny and June, and Gilbert Grape. So they took a gamble with him, and the studio wasn't really sure if this character was going to be the right fit, because this character rides the razor's edge of the right amount of comedy and the right amount of seriousness. Whereas in other movies, it might be tempted to really go overboard with the comedic timing. The introduction to Jack Sparrow is one of the best character introductions that I've ever witnessed. Him standing on the crow's nest of his boat with the musical score by Klaus Badelt, feeling very adventurous and exciting, like you're actually watching someone who's larger than life. But then he jumps down onto the deck of his boat, and it's revealed to be a very small sailboat. Walking onto the deck as his boat is sinking and offering a bribe to someone who wants to know what his purpose is there. Very little to no words spoken, but we learn everything we need to know about this character. He acts all haughty and confident, but that's really all it is. It's just a facade, but that's one among many other things that makes his character so entertaining. Learning along the way that he's also a pirate and he has an agenda up his sleeve. What do you say to 3 shillings? And we forget the name. There's also a few things that he does in here that I don't really think if this movie were to come out today would be able to get away with. Being from the studio of Disney, you can't really exactly go fully too far in some of the areas that they suggest, particularly with the violent content. They suggest enough of the type of violence that's being portrayed without it being too gory. I'm not one of those people that wants every film to be risky and audacious as some other people on YouTube seemingly want to happen all the time. I'm the kind of guy who wants to see how it's done in execution, and in the case of Curse of the Black Pearl, I think it was a really bold move, while also finding the right amount of safety to it as well, trying to keep it within the framework of the studio behind the production. Would you see something like this in today's world of cinema? Maybe not. But even so, similar to Raiders of the Lost Ark, this is like lightning in a bottle. How exactly are you able to replicate something like this? Even its sequels couldn't exactly recapture that energy. But we see him being portrayed as a scoundrel when he holds Elizabeth Swann hostage after saving her, giving her a subtle hug while being very gleeful about it in front of her father and Commodore Norrington. "Commodore, my effects, please, and my hat." "Commodore!" Some of you probably know this, but Johnny Depp has publicly talked about how Keith Richards was a big influence for him with his portrayal of this character. Now, my dad is a big Rolling Stones fan, and I do like the Rolling Stones music for the most part. As I've gotten older, I've realized some of their songs are not exactly appropriate. That's a whole nother discussion for another day. But basically, I can definitely see Keith Richards in Johnny Depp's portrayal. The voice, the body movements, the way he moves his hands. He's very eccentric and odd and very bohemian. Depp has also said in interviews that he feels that pirates back in the 18th century were like the rock stars of those times. So it doesn't really surprise me that he was able to use Keith Richards in that way as an influence. But along the way, he runs into Will Turner, played by Orlando Bloom, who's a blacksmith in Port Royal, and has his own little troubled past that he can't really seem to run away from, even though he tries really hard to push it away. Orlando Bloom, I think, is actually quite good in this role. In this movie, at least. I'm a little iffy on him in the following sequels, even though I kind of like where they play his character, since he is destined to be a pirate. And with knowing what happens in the following sequels, the experience watching this movie was somewhat enhanced for me. When he learns that his father, Bootstrap Bill Turner, was a pirate, and he, Will, has been training to fight pirates his entire life, knowing that it's in his blood now and he can't seem to run away from it, it's something that he has a hard time reconciling with. And Keira Knightley as Elizabeth is probably the most weakest character development as far as the three main leads, but she still serves her purpose just fine. And thankfully, she's not the typical damsel in distress that you would expect from a movie like this. She is not afraid to stand up to Jack and call him out on his BS when she learns that all he did was lie on a beach drinking rum, when we hear throughout the movie that he made this really big escape. But what I do like about this romance is that Will and Elizabeth are expected to play their own respective parts in their societal backgrounds. The governor's daughter is not expected to marry the local blacksmith. And I don't think it was really done ham-fistedly. I think it was very effective in how they played it. Come to think of it, I think this movie in some ways is very similar to A New Hope. Star Wars A New Hope. Will Turner is the Luke Skywalker and Elizabeth is the Princess Leia. I mean, they're both royalty. Not really surprising. With Will Turner's past, his father being a pirate, Luke Skywalker has a very similar experience when he learns that his father was a dark side force user. And Captain Jack Sparrow is the Han Solo.
I've got one very important thing, mate. I'm Captain Jack Sparrow.
Remind you of anybody else?
Hey, it's me.
Underneath all the stuff with Jack Sparrow, what he's really driving for is to get his hands back on the Black Pearl, because it's revealed as the film goes on that he was the captain of the Black Pearl, and when they discovered this gold that was passed down by Cortez, besides Jack, the crew was consumed by their greed for the gold, and his first mate, Barbossa, led a mutiny. The greed eventually caught up with Barbossa and the crew, and they became cursed. Due to Cortez's greed as well, it was naturally passed down, and now they're members of the undead. Whenever they go out into the moonlight at night, they're revealed to be walking living skeletons. And they peel back the reveal of this very slowly, and particularly in the gallows scene. The one pirate puts him in a chokehold, and we see that these guys aren't exactly normal. Now, we can't talk about that without mentioning Geoffrey Rush as Captain Barbossa. What a great addition in this movie that easily also could have gone south, similar to Jack Sparrow. The explanation they use of how he and his crew became cursed is very eerie and suspenseful. It's an exposition scene, yes, but it's at least in a location or they have something going on that keeps the audience captivated, which is exactly how you should do something expository. And since Elizabeth lied about her first name in order to protect her father, they think that she's the descendant of Bootstrap Bill, and it's revealed that Bootstrap was the guy that tried to take the gold away or say, no, you deserve to be cursed. And he stole the last medallion and gave it to his son, Will. Now, if you've seen the sequels, you obviously know what happens to him. In the case of this movie, they seemingly can't find him, so they have to rely on his descendant in order to lift the curse. And the way they reveal the crew in the skeleton forms is horrifying, but also very exciting as well. Seeing how Elizabeth is tossed around the ship and seeing all this stuff happening in front of her, this is the prime example for me, among many others, that your audience reactions should match the reactions that the characters have in the story as well. Despite them showing it in the trailers at the time, I still shuddered with fear, in all the right ways, when Barbossa walks into the moonlight. Elizabeth's reaction was more or less how I responded on the first viewing. You best start believing in ghost stories, Miss Turner. You're in one. And I just realized gosh, I cannot talk about this movie without bringing up these two morons from the pirate crew. I can't for the life of me remember the characters' names or the actors' names, but this guy right here, I recognize him from the show Seinfeld. He made like 2 appearances. In particular, the first time that he shows up in that series was when he and George fight over a parking space when he's on his way to visit Jerry. Hello, chum. Pfft, you got something of ours, and the gold calls to us. And then there's this guy who keeps losing his eye.
Tell him what Barbossa did.
I'm telling a story!
On the flip side, there's these 2 soldiers that Jack runs into when he's trying to steal the one ship, the Interceptor. I said no lies! I think he's telling the truth. If he were telling the truth, he wouldn't have told us. Unless, of course, he knew that you wouldn't believe the truth, even if he told it to you. Inevitably, Will decides to recruit Jack in order to save Elizabeth, so they manage to steal the Interceptor and head to Tortuga, which is a very unlawful place in the Caribbean, but it's the right kind of place that they could find the type of crew that they need in order to find the Black Pearl. We also learn another detail about Jack, that he's a womanizer, or at least he tried to be, and he's not... Well, no, he doesn't keep his word at all. He's terrible at it. The 3 women he encounters on this island all give him a big slap in the face. And the last one is Anna Maria. Zoe Saldana, Gamora from Guardians of the Galaxy, and Uhura in the recent Star Trek films. I suppose you didn't deserve that one. No, that one I deserve. And we progressively learn more information about Jack as the film goes on. When they're on the ship on their way to the island, that Jack has this pistol with only 1 shot. Everybody else scoffs at it, but we also realize that he's saving that 1 shot for one person that wronged him. Barbossa. We see many times earlier on that when he's tempted to use his pistol, he hesitates, particularly when he and Will are in their first fight in the blacksmith shop. You cheated. Pirate, how's your footwork? Very good. I am seriously losing it right now. I cannot help myself. I am so sorry, guys. Oh, and when Jack is talking to Gibbs and he's motioning towards Will Turner, instantly reminded me of this moment in Force Awakens.
Oh, there's an access tunnel that leads... Why are you doing that? Why are you doing this? I'm trying to come up with a plan.
But Jack is also the kind of guy who constantly shifts sides. His loyalties are really kind of hard to lock down, but as opposed to Mac in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, where we don't really know anything about him besides what we're told in the opening of that movie, it's all done for a purpose here. He has a clear goal. He wants to get back the Black Pearl and get his revenge on Barbossa. He'll do and say whatever it takes to achieve that goal. Even if somewhere in the back of his mind Barbossa might know that he's lying, he still has a way of pulling people in. Even Will is not exactly thrilled of the idea of recruiting him initially, but at that point, since the Royal Navy isn't going to listen to him, what other options does he have? Where does it make birth? Where does it make birth? Have you not heard the stories? Again, it's just the right amount of comedy that could have easily been overdone if they just let him run wild. But thankfully, everything in this movie feels very airtight. There's not one single moment or scene that feels out of place or meandering just to let the film breathe. I wouldn't have necessarily had a problem with it, but I also don't really think that would have been necessary, especially after rewatching it recently. And I haven't really talked much about the technical aspects, the makeup, the production design, the cinematography. This is another example of cinema at its finest. In particular, this shot when the crew of the Black Pearl are walking under the ship in the water and Klaus Badelt's music is playing. Similar to what I said in my Titanic review, that's something that you show in film school. Speaking of the score, it's all very fitting for this type of movie. But also Hans Zimmer had a hand in it too. Even though he's not fully credited, due to contractual obligations, he couldn't exactly officially score the film, but he managed to put it together overnight supposedly and gave it to Badelt. If there's any doubts that I have about Hans Zimmer, that threw them all out the window. Plus the main theme, I think we all know that, don't we? The Tampa Bay Buccaneers even play that at their home games in order to get the crowd amped up. Similar for the Eagles' home games in Philly when they use the Rocky music to get their fans amped up. So inevitably the battle happens, with Jack fighting Barbossa and Will fighting off some of the crew nearby, and Norrington's men on their ship fighting off Barbossa's men who came to kill them. And while it might feel jumbled on the surface, it's all relevant towards each other. They're all trying to lift the curse while Barbossa's men are trying to achieve their own goal. And Elizabeth, unfortunately, doesn't really get the support of Jack's crew when she frees them and decides to go in on her own.
I'm gonna teach you the meaning of pain!
You like pain? Try wearing a corset.
Once again, showing that she's very capable and doesn't really need anybody's help. I must admit, Jack, I thought I had you figured. Turns out you're a hard man to predict. Me, I'm dishonest. And a dishonest man you can always trust to be dishonest. Honestly. it's the honest ones you ought to watch out for. To see the fighting between these two with the musical score playing, I always have the biggest smile on my face because this is my kind of genre. Whether it's a comic book movie like Marvel or DC, or something like Star Wars where it's sci-fi, fantasy, adventure, action adventure is my favorite genre, or at least different flavors of it, if you know what I mean, depending on the film. But this is the kind of adventure film that I never get tired of. And then inevitably the curse is lifted, but I love how it plays out. When it looks like Barbossa is actually going to kill Elizabeth, you hear a gunshot from off camera, and you think for a second, did Elizabeth get shot? But then we see that Jack fired the pistol. Barbossa brags about how he wasted his shot, but then Will reveals that he caught the medallion, sliced his hand with the blood along with Jack's blood, therefore the curse is gone and Barbossa's dead. The rest of the crew is lifted of the curse and eventually arrested, but then Jack is eventually arrested for piracy. Will stages a failed escape attempt. Elizabeth then announces that she wants to be with Will, and rather than being confrontational about the whole thing, Norrington accepts her choice, but also comes to respect Jack, even though he says a couple times throughout the movie that he's the worst pirate that he's ever run into, and begrudgingly agrees that he actually might be better than he gave him credit for. After everything that he experienced with the battle against Barbossa's men, he actually sees the potential in Jack and realizes, maybe this guy isn't so bad after all. And he just lets him go. Well, at least one day's head start, realizing that sometimes a piracy act is the right approach. So the Black Pearl returns with Jack's crew, and he gets the ship back, and they're off to do wherever the wind or the ocean takes them. I might go as far as to say that Curse of the Black Pearl is probably among my all-time favorite films. If I had to make a top 10 or top 20 list, maybe not in the top 10, but it would definitely be somewhere close to the top tier category. The right kind of balance of comedy and seriousness, and just enough of a suggestion of the type of violence that's being portrayed, but not being so gratuitous, and a very effective and exciting swashbuckling adventure that if you're into this kind of movie, this is the one for you, including a character that has become so iconic that Johnny Depp even received an Oscar nomination for it. And he'll even go out of his way to talk to young kids dressed up as Captain Jack Sparrow, someone who really seems to appreciate what he's doing and is not doing it for show. To see that from a celebrity, that's a really big plus. Those are my thoughts on Curse of the Black Pearl. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are if you've seen it. And as always, see you in the next one.